I am finally back with a new, well, kind of a new video. The reason I say that is because this was actually shot about 2 years ago already at the time of the uploading of this video. Henry Cavill, aka Superman, aka Geralt of Rivia, uploaded a video of him putting together a new PC around the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. This served as an inspiration to make a parody or satire version of that video. However, since I wanted my content to be more useful to the viewers or audience, I decided to just make my first ever PC build video, especially since I was going to tear down and clean my PC at that time anyways. I wanted to upload the video right away, but kinda lost focus multiple times during the editing process. But now, finally, this PC build video is now complete. If you are a first time or rookie PC builder and you're looking for a guide on how to do so, I hope this video can help you out with most, if not all, of your questions or concerns about PC building. Without further ado, here's the video. So, here we have the motherboard laid out on top of its own box. For the first few steps, I will be placing or installing the NVMe SSD, as well as the processor, CPU cooler, and the RAM. For me, this is the more convenient way of doing it. However, you could also choose to do it the other way around, which is to place the motherboard first inside the case before installing the components that I mentioned. This would depend, I guess, on your preference, but more importantly, on the size and type of the components to be installed, as well as the free space within your case. Now, moving on. This here is the NVMe SSD. This end is where the screw is mounted to fix the SSD in place. And on one end of it are the contact pins that go into the dedicated slot of the motherboard. If you would see, there are 4 holes into which you could put in the holding screw for the NVMe SSD. You will not put 4 screws into the 4 holes, but rather put just 1 screw into the appropriate hole, depending on the size or specifically the length of your NVMe SSD. This one that I have is a 2280 NVMe SSD, which means it is 22mm wide and 80mm long, which I think is the most common one these days. So for that, I will put the screw into the second hole from the left. If you don't know the dimensions of your NVMe SSD, you can actually just try to line it up on the board and see which hole the opposite end of the NVMe SSD will match with. Insert the NVMe SSD at an angle, about 45 degrees, into its slot. It doesn't need much force, just enough for the contact pins to enter the slot. Once you have the NVMe SSD inserted into its slot, secure it with the mounting screw. Next up is the processor. Here I have the AMD Ryzen 5 2600, which, along with the other AMD Ryzen processors, is of socket type AM4. You have to take note here that your processor and the motherboard socket type should match, and that it is something that you should consider prior to purchasing your components for your build. In mounting the processor, you should first lift the retention arm of the socket, and that is done by pressing down on the lever, moving it slightly away from the socket, and then lifting it up. In mounting processors, you should look for the golden triangle found in one corner of the processor and match it to the corner of the motherboard socket with the corresponding triangle or indicator to ensure that your processor is oriented properly. Once you have placed the processor into the socket, give it a slight wiggle to ensure that all the pins have fallen into the tiny socket holes. Once that is done, just reverse the process done earlier for the retention arm. Just basically push it all the way down, move it towards the socket, and let go. Next step would be to mount the CPU cooler. For that, you would need to place some thermal paste on the processor first before the actual mounting of the cooler. Since the cooler is not brand new and the stock paste has already been used and removed previously. In applying thermal paste, I would say to just follow the common advice, which is to use an amount equivalent to the size of a single grain of rice, and placing it in the middle of the processor's IHS or integrated heat spreader. In case you accidentally put a little more thermal paste than needed or advised, don't worry about it, as this wouldn't have a negative impact 99.99% of the time. As for the cooler, I wouldn't be going into the specifics of how it is done, since the mounting option for this Deepcool Gamax 400 is not really the most common amongst air coolers, at least based from what I know. But to summarize, it uses these stock mounting pieces that came with the motherboard, and the cooler itself does not actually use screws to secure to the mounts, but rather these flexible metal pins. Next is installing the memory or RAM sticks or modules onto the motherboard. So this 8x sized board has 4 memory slots, but we only have 2 sticks. For this, the common advice is to use the one farthest away from the CPU socket, then skip one slot before installing your second memory module. For this board, and maybe other models from other brands as well, the slots are color-coded, which helps explain what I just said about the slot selection. In this scenario, I will be installing the modules in the red colored slots. Open or release the locks first on both ends of each slot you will use, then place the memory modules following the correct orientation using the notch in the pins as reference. Just apply an even amount of downward pressure on both ends of each module until the tabs or the locks make a click sound, which means they are now locked back in place. Next, let's work on the installation or placement of the power supply unit or PSU into our case. This particular PSU that I'm using is a modular type, which means all the cables going in and out of it can be disconnected. This offers me more space within the PSU basement, since I don't have to connect all the cables that came with the PSU, but just those that I will be needing for this build. Those include the 24-pin and 8-pin cables that are connected to the motherboard, the 8-pin or 6-pin cables needed to power the GPU, and the cables to power the SATA devices in the build. Though there are cases that utilize the mounting plate for the PSU, wherein you take out this rear part, secure the PSU onto it with screws, and slide the whole thing back, this case uses the more traditional way of placing the PSU, which is through the side of the case, particularly the right side, since you can't do it from the left because of the non-removable basement or shroud. Since shooting while working is not my forte, shout out to Kyle Hansen of the channel Bitwit for making this task look easy, let's utilize some editing magic to place and mount this PSU into the case. By the way, I will be orienting the PSU fan side down in the case. The PSU is now properly placed in the basement. You still have to put in the 4 screws here to make sure that the PSU stays in place. Now that the PSU is fixed into its proper position, let's work a little bit on the cable routing. As you can see, we have a mess of cables here, but let's prioritize the ones that are going to be connected to the motherboard and the GPU. Now, since we are done installing the components onto the motherboard, let's mount the motherboard into the case. As you can see, through preparing the needed power cables earlier on, the 8-pin, 24-pin, and GPU power cables are now routed correctly into their own case holes. So once the motherboard is mounted, it becomes easier to connect them right away. Before placing the motherboard itself, we need to make sure that the right number of motherboard standoffs are already in place. As you can see here, The 9 standoffs that the motherboard uses are already installed. Once the motherboard is placed, make sure that the holes are as much as possible lined up with the standoffs. Let's pause the video here for a moment. For the viewers who already know how to build PCs and who are paying close attention to the steps that I am going through, you would have noticed that there was a certain part here that I unintentionally missed. It's not a critical step, technically speaking, meaning the PC will run fine even if we did proceed without going back and correcting that mistake. However, since this is a tutorial or guide video, let's take a step back and work on that error. If in case you didn't notice, here it is encircled. So that back part of the case is a rectangular hole wherein you place what's called the rear I/O shield. For most, if not all, of premium model motherboards, you wouldn't have to place a rear I/O shield onto that rectangular hole, as the I/O shield will already be built in or integrated onto the motherboard itself. For all other kinds of traditional motherboards, however, especially lower tier ones like this B450 Gaming Plus one that I am using, the I/O shield is separate from the motherboard, and you would have to fix it into that hole first before placing down and securing the motherboard. By the way, just as a note, the rear I/O shield should come with the motherboard. I am not aware of any contemporary motherboard model or company that does not supply its own I/O shield. This is the rear I/O shield for the MSI B450 Gaming Plus motherboard. It follows the board's aesthetic with a black colored base and red accents. To secure it, simply place it into the hole from the inner side of the case and carefully push down on all sides until you feel each side click into place. Be mindful that the edges of the rear I/O shield can be quite sharp, so watch out when pushing down on them to avoid breaking open the skin on your fingertips. Also, don't forget to consider the correct position or orientation of the rear I/O shield. As a clue, the circular holes for the 3.5mm jacks should be at the bottom part, like so. Going back to mounting the motherboard, you can just repeat the steps earlier, but this time also making sure that the rear ports of the motherboard line up with the holes of the rear I/O shield. I have now installed all 9 screws to hold down the motherboard onto the case. And with that, we can now proceed to the next step, which is to connect the 8-pin and 24-pin power cables. Take note that these connectors are keyed, meaning you wouldn't be able to force them in the wrong way. But just to also help you orient it correctly during your first attempt, you can check the lock on the power connector and match it to the side of the connector on the motherboard with a tab. And another thing you ideally shouldn't forget is to connect the power cable of the CPU fan onto the corresponding connector or pins on the motherboard prior to placing the motherboard into the case. For this scenario, since the CPU fan's power cable does not reach the pins on the motherboard, I will be using this cable extension that came with the Noctua fan. So this is the end that connects to the CPU fan power cable, while the other end connects to the motherboard. Now, since this extension cable is definitely much longer than what I need, I will be tucking away the excess through the case's routing hole at the top to hide the cable and to help with the aesthetics. Going to the other side of the case, you can start to plan how to properly cable manage this specific situation. The excess cable I just mentioned can be secured in place using twist ties and this mounting spot on the case. The 8-pin power cable can be routed to the right side and can be kind of tucked into the case's lip and make it run all the way down onto the PSU. Next up, we have these front panel I/O cables that I will try to tuck into the left lip of the case this time and make it run towards the top of the PSU where there are case holes specifically for those cables, as the standard placement of corresponding pins on the motherboard are actually at the bottom part of it. After routing these cables into the correct case holes, we then connect them to the corresponding pins on the motherboard. This one on the left is the HD audio or front panel audio connector. That allows you to plug in 3.5mm microphone and headset jacks into the front ports. This next one, which looks a lot similar to the HD audio connector, is the USB 2.0 connector. While these tiny separate connectors are the connectors for the power on switch, power LED, hard drive LED, and reset switch. This thick one with the blue colored end is the USB 3.0 connector. Now, since this is a little difficult again to do while also shooting the video, I'll just connect the cables off cam and we'll jump to when all the cables are properly connected. As you can see here, the cables are now connected to their proper pins on the motherboard. Again, from left to right, we have the HD audio connector, the USB 2.0 connector, the USB 3.0 connector, and the switch and LED connectors. By the way, for the switch and LED connectors, you can follow this reference image here for the layout of the pins. From what I know, this is an established standard, so this will be the pin layout regardless of the brand and or model of the motherboard. Now we can see that most of the components are now properly installed and organized from this side of the case. Let's move on to installing the case fans. The fans that I'm using in this rig are the DarkForce DR12 fans. I bought the set that includes the controller box and the remote, and added some more fans so that I have a total of 6 fans. Just a quick note here, you must consider the orientation of a fan when installing it into your case, in order to facilitate proper airflow. In order to know which side the air goes into and which side the air goes out of, you can look at the center of the fan for, at least usually, the brand logo or name. On this side, we can see that this is where the DarkForce logo and sticker is. And that means that this is the front of the fan, which in turn means that this side is where the air goes into. And naturally, the other side, which is the back side, is where air goes out of. However, for these fans though, it unfortunately has a sticker or the logo on both sides of the fan. So in this case, in the case of other similar fans, another approach you can use is to check the side of the fan where the power cable comes out of. You can see that the cable is actually towards one side of the fan and not exactly in the middle. The side of the fan that the cable comes out of is the back side or rear of the fan, which again means that that is the side of the fan that air goes out of. Now, for the placement of the fans, since I will be using 6 of these, the 2 on top and the 1 on the rear will all be exhaust fans, meaning they will be responsible for pushing hot air out of the case. And for that, we must consider the orientation that I just explained. So for the fans on top, they will be placed this way, with the cable side on top, while the fan at the rear will be placed like this, with the cable side at the left, or facing the back side of the case. Again, since it is difficult to do while shooting the video, let me just do it off cam and jump back when I am done. Alright, so we now have all 6 fans installed, with the 2 up top and the 1 at the rear as exhaust, and the 3 in the front as intake. By the way, for the 3 fans at the front, just follow the opposite logic as that of for the exhaust fans for the orientation or placement. This balanced number of intake and exhaust fans allows what is called a neutral air pressure inside the case. And air pressure is one topic that I think I will be delving into in a future video. By the way, for the routing of the fan cables, I have routed the cables of the exhaust fans in the upper left case holes, near where the 8-pin motherboard cable was placed. While for the intake fans, I oriented them so that the cables are to the right of the case, or the side of the case with the right metal side panel. This is so that I can properly route the cables through the case holes and connect them all to the DR12 controller. Flipping the case so that we can see the other side better, we will finally move on to every PC builder's favorite part, which is cable management. The excess or slack for the CPU fan cable extension, along with the cables of the front panel I/O, I'll be routing through this upper lip of the case, while also trying to use this tie down point as needed. Once at the end, I will then move all these cables and route them through this right lip of the case all the way down until I reach the top portion of the PSU. Just a quick tangent here. For this case, I opted to place a couple of 2.5-inch SATA SSDs here, but will place them last so as not to be in the way of cable management. For the other cables, this time on the left side, I'll use the left lip of the case to route and hide them, also all the way down to the bottom of the case. This 24-pin cable I will be securing onto place so it doesn't push against the right side panel when we close it. Since this is quite impossible to do while shooting, let's again use some editing magic and jump to the part where I am already done with the cables on the right. And ta-da! As mentioned, I made use of this case lip on the right side to try and hide or tuck the cables, and using as much tie down points as I can. I will basically be doing the same to these cables on the left. I'm gonna route some of them here, some of them here, and some of them here, and some that needs to reach the PSU area. This is the fan controller that I mentioned earlier, and I think I will be placing it beside the PSU, since I don't think there are any other options due to the space constraint and cable length constraint. You can see that I already secured the 24-pin cable down to the case with some Velcro straps. As I also mentioned earlier, these are the two SSDs already mounted on the plate that came with the case. It uses these two sort of feet at the bottom that hooks onto holes into the case, and then with a single screw at the top portion. So, as not to bore you any longer, I will do all of these off cam and come back with the final product. Okay, so as you can see, I am now finally done. Let's just not look too closely here at the bottom. Oh no! Well, you're just gonna have to trust me when I say that I did my best here. Some cables really weren't that long to properly tie or tuck them, so they just ended up here in the PSU basement. SATA connections to the drives are very secure, and these are not gonna go anywhere. The fan controller I did place here, but chose not to mount it to the PSU. All the fans are connected to it now. Let's go back to the other side. We are mostly done with this side, but let's not forget the most important component of a gaming PC, which is the internal Wi-Fi card. Just kidding. The graphics card, of course. Now on an 80X size motherboard, there is usually at least two full-length PCIe slots, which is the case for this motherboard. I will use the upper slot if the two open slots at the back are any indication. Since, also for most if not all motherboards, that is the one with the 16x speed. If you use a slot with just 8x speed or even lower than that, you might not be able to use your GPU's maximum potential. I can't give you the exact science to it, but trust me, if it is available and there are no conflicts of any kind, you would want to use the 16x slot on your motherboard. Don't forget to push down on the locking tab for the slot before trying to insert your GPU. Some editing magic again here, and the GPU is now in the 16x PCIe slot. And the screws already mounted as well. This case comes with this metal bracket for the PCIe slots, which I still don't really understand how to use to this day, but let's just use it anyway. Yep, there it is. Let's also not forget, of course, to power our GPU. Similar to the motherboard's 24-pin cable, I am using these red and black cable extensions for both the 6-pin and 8-pin PCIe power of the GPU. Let me just try to wiggle these in place so that they are correctly oriented. In goes the 6-pin one, and in goes the 8-pin one. Okay, so a couple of hours later, after cleaning the mess that I made in my room, I've already put the PC tower to its original location. And it is time to see if I did everything, or mostly, correctly, and it boots. Or if it doesn't boot, which means I probably forgot to connect something. Powering on the PSU. Then the PC. We have motherboard lights and fan blade rotation. Okay, come on now. Don't make me look bad. Yes! There we go! We have post! The motherboard is just telling me that there was a change done to the memory configuration, since that feature on the motherboard is enabled right now in the BIOS. So no issues with getting this message or screen. Okay, so that is it for my first ever PC build video. What you're seeing now is the current state of my personal rig, the same one found in this video. There obviously have been notable changes, but a lot of the parts are still the same, like the case fans, and the motherboard. There are actually a few upgrades that I have already planned to do for this rig, and I will most likely be documenting that again and turning it into content as another, hopefully more comprehensive and more entertaining build video. So do watch out for that. In case you have some feedback on this type of content or on the specifics of this PC build video, do let me know down in the comment section. Click that like button as well as the subscribe button to show your support to my channel. As always, thank you for watching and see you all again in my next video.